Hello everyone, in this video I am going to be looking at the Cratchits, Christmas and representation of the family in A Christmas Carol. I don't think you can really talk about the Cratchits without talking about Christmas or even the family, because they are so intertwined in Dickens's novel. So first of all, I think we need to talk about Christmas on a broad sense. So for Dickens, he felt that Christmas was important and that it shouldn't bring about self-denial, renunciation, or emotional withdrawal. For him, Christmas was a time of sharing one's riches, emotional, spiritual, monetary, within the community of man. So a feast is a wonderful thing, but only if one has loved ones with whom to share it. And I think that that's one of the main messages that comes through in A Christmas Carol. In this sense, the ghost of the Christmas present also represents empathy, and it's through the Cratchit family, in fact, that Scrooge is able to feel that himself. The Cratchits, represent the sort of hardship that many Victorians experience in their daily toil. And so you could argue that, in essence, the celebratory aspects of Christmas that Dickens promotes are grounded in this sort of empathetic generosity. So Christmas should stimulate within people a concern for the wants and needs of others, and perhaps a euphoric joy in fulfilling these desires. So the scene at Bob Cratchit's unassuming little abode at the Cratchits family at Christmas is really pivotal in the development of the novella. So Dickens uses the opportunity to put forth a poignant criticism of the unfeeling members of what he feels are perhaps a disconnected upper class, and to present a highly sentimentalised portrait of the lower classes. You could argue that the Cratchit family themselves are quite one-dimensional, but they're allegorical in nature. They're meant to represent something. So I think this picture is designed to address and undermine Victorian class prejudice at the time. And Dickens, I think, was trying to awaken his readers to the harsh realities of poverty. So we need to remember, of course, that in 1843, when A Christmas Carol was written, England had particularly stringent laws including the payment of debts and the condition of penury. And of course, there were the politicians and the theorists were attempting to justify these conditions in places like the prisons and the workhouses. And with arguments designed to delegitimise the rights of the underclass, a move that further hindered the ability of the poor. And this was something that Dickens felt very strongly about. Dickens' conception of Christmas is fundamentally connected to the idea of feasting. And this is profoundly expressive of human happiness that he believed the festivals of Christmas should promote. So actually, it plugs directly into the medieval and pagan idea of defying the evil forces apparently overtaking nature, as well as storing up of resources to face the wintry fight ahead. Of course, January and February being very cold and difficult times, particularly for those in society who are poor. Setting it at Christmas, though, also allows him to just really amplify and emphasise his message. We know that Christmas is a time that those who have not feel more strongly the sense of their lack in comparison to those people around them who have. So for Dickens, it's sort of a coming together of people around a table, the celebration of their humanity, the sharing of their bounty, the reward of indulgence, even if that is only once a year, of course. And that is the essence of the meal. And we could describe Dickens as an abstemious man, meaning he actually was quite reserved and moderate in his partaking of food and drink. But his ability, therefore, to render this simple food and drink overwhelmingly desirable is astonishing. I think in the description of the food, the fact that they have so little and it's such a wonderful thing that they're experiencing is really impressive. The preparation of the food is as life-enhancing as the consumption as well. So we need to remember that the valiant struggle of the Cratchits to make their meagre ingredients feel like a feast is, for them, triumphantly successful, and I think it's probably one of the most affecting sections of the novella, because it creates quite a lot of pathos for them, and it makes you sort of really appreciate what it is that you've got. And the Cratchits, they've ensured that despite these low finances that they've experienced, they will have what every family in England expected to have on a Christmas day. And so I think it's worth just talking about that first. So here's the main description. There never was such a goose. Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavour, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by apple sauce, mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family indeed, as Mr. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish. They hadn't ate it all at last, yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose, a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hullo, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like a washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like an eating house and a pastry cook's next door to each other, with a laundress's next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing, in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with the Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, wonderful pudding, Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind, she would confess she had had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. So through the language that Dickens is using here, he is really emphasising the fact that they are happy with so little. And look at how much they put upon this particular pudding and how important it is to them. You can see through the use of the anaphora of suppose it should not be done enough, suppose, the fear in Mrs. Cratchit that something could happen to this, which was just this prized item of their Christmas dinner. You can also see through the use of exclamatives and the use of hyperbolic language, the extremely large quantifiers, universal admiration, that actually this is something that is incredibly important to everybody, this one Christmas pudding, despite its small size. So it's probably a good idea to think about a little bit of context here so that you can really understand this dichotomy of poverty and greed. So so the Cratchits have somehow ensured that even though they've got hardly any money, they have created this ideal Christmas meal that everybody in England would hopefully be experiencing. So goose and turkey were quite common on Christmas Day, particularly in the Victorian era. And goose had been established as a Christmas fare actually since the times of Elizabeth I. So although it was a luxury only really affordable by a poor man if he belonged to a goose club, which is where they would pay in a certain amount of money each week, the temperance movement, they actually waged a war against the consumption of alcohol during this time, and they took quite a lot of contempt towards the goose clubs, which were often equivalent to pubs, and they sort of lured their members into spending salaries on drink. But a goose like the Cratchits would be cooked at the baker's in the village or the town, and few working class households had ovens at this time. So the baker, for a small amount of money, would leave the ovens alight on Christmas Day. And so the families would take their gooses there to be cooked. And we know that this is where the younger Cratchits go. But then, thanks to the influx of poultry from France in the 1840s, geese actually became a lot more available. The Christmas pudding, that was such a feature at the Cratchits' Christmas, was probably on most people's menus in the Victorian holiday period. So in the London News in 1843, they noted that in a household where there are 5 or 6 children, the eldest not above 10 or 11, the making of the pudding is indeed an event. And then the same paper regarded the prowess in this area as a matter of patriotic pride. The French have no idea how to make a plum pudding, but some friendly genius instructed the English in the art. The plum pudding symbolises so much English antiquity, English superstition, English enterprise, English generosity, and above all, English taste. And I thought that would be a quote that would probably amuse you. So, I mean, I think they're saying here how important this plum pudding is. And like mince pies, which were originally made with shredded meat, the plum pudding also contained things like boiled beef and mutton, and was actually a form of frumenty, which is like a thick porridge made from wheat. And it did contain things like raisins and currants and prunes, and that's where it gets its name of a plum pudding from. Because but this was sort of before the use of raisins particularly. And then when it was thickened with eggs and breadcrumbs and dried fruits, and then eventually ales and spirits, so it sort of changed over time. But the Puritans banned it. They felt that it was probably too enjoyable, but also included quite a lot of what might have been seen as extravagant ingredients. But then George I restored it, and the church agreed that puddings should be made on the 25th Sunday after Trinity and prepared with 13 ingredients to represent Christ and the 12 apostles, and it was to be stirred by every family member in turn from east to west in honour of the wise men and their supposed journey in that direction. So mince pies seem to have had their origin in a representation also of Christ's manger, because they used to be oblong shape. And then they would have inside a little pastry baby, which represented Jesus, which is quite nice. It's a shame that they're not like that still. And according to the tradition, if one ate a mince pie on each of the 12 days of Christmas, one would have 12 days of happiness, which was, in a sense, what the whole feast was about, enjoying oneself, so that it would last the whole year. And I certainly am quite happy to try ensuring I eat a mince pie on every 12 days of Christmas for 12 days of happiness. And that's happiness in itself, isn't it, eating a mince pie? So the mulled wine also is referred to in A Christmas Carol, but it was offered, I think the thing is that the representations of it is that it offered sort of immediate gratification. So when Scrooge, who is maybe reluctant to be toasted by the Cratchits, or at least some of them, in his reformed state, he wants to sit and talk to Bob about his plans for Bob's future. So he does so over a smoking bishop, which is made by pouring red wine over bitter oranges and then mulling the liquid in a vessel with a long funnel and putting sugar and spices in. So it's essentially what we call mulled wine today. So the Cratchits was like everything else at their feast, cheaply made. So instead of the traditional way of doing it, Bob turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer. And it's interesting here, isn't it? Because, of course, the gin is something that would have been seen to be significantly cheaper than wine, in fact. But it is sufficient to its purpose. And we've got the quote there where it says, "At last the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compounds in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with the beaming looks while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. Then Bob proposed, 'A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us.'" So we know that Dickens had great faith in the humanising power of the Christmas feast. He was thinking, as always, principally of the poor, and in his next Christmas book he also positively attacks the rich, not so much for their wealth as for their indifference to the suffering of others. But the idea for him of making Christmas and marking it with abundance runs through his writings. And we can see that in other texts as well, such as Great Expectations, where there's a dismal Christmas dinner with Joe Gargery and Mrs. Joe for Pip. And quite an interesting quote here as well from Thomas Carlyle, who was a friend of his and a contemporary. Their political and intellectual views were not aligned, and whilst Thomas Carlyle had a lot of respect for him, he didn't really, and he acknowledged his literary genius, he never really believed in some of the same things that he believed in, particularly being a humanitarian. And his quote here is quite interesting because he says, "His theory of life was entirely wrong. He believed that men should be buttered up and world made soft and accommodating for them, and all sorts of fellows should have a turkey for Christmas dinner." And he can't really get his head around the fact that actually that everybody has a right to have this wonderful experience. Or equally, you could interpret it that he's saying, why is having a nice Christmas dinner going to make everything okay? And we can see that for Dickens, it's the humanising power of coming together and sharing that sort of warmth and generosity with each other. Okay, so we need to remember that the characters on the whole in A Christmas Carol are allegorical, so they represent certain things. So Bob Cratchit is, in his simplicity, he represents people living in poverty who nevertheless create a loving home and behave with honest dignity. He doesn't complain about his situation, he keeps going, and that creates pathos for the poor, especially since some of the views at the particular time were that that people sort of deserved their situations. If we think about the poor law, particularly in the ideas of Thomas Malthus, which I'm going to come back to later. Fezziwig's character, he represents, he's a role model for how an employer should behave. He sees his employees as an extension of his family, and he represents sort of this as a different kind of richness, the wealth and love. And it's interesting because Scrooge really idolises him in the beginning of the novella, not in the beginning, but in his early life when he works for him, and yet he doesn't embody any of the qualities that were modelled to him by Fezziwig during his times as an apprentice. Tiny Tim, he represents the most vulnerable in society. He is annoyingly and excessively virtuous. So like Jesus, though, he is an innocent being who suffers because of others' sins, and he has a sort of salutary effect on Scrooge. The knowledge that his death was caused by a lack of money to pay for the necessary treatment contributes to Scrooge's change of heart. So he's quite important, therefore, within the plot as well as representing those truly good of heart Christian values of the time. So Fred is also representative of a good-natured and benevolent being, and he is therefore an antithesis to Scrooge. So if we think about that in a little bit more detail, the wider purpose and significance of these characters within the text, they're there to demonstrate that the poor are not all idle and undeserving, as some people felt at the time. In fact, they're significantly more good than the richer characters such as Scrooge and Marley. They represent safety and protection in a society where there was little provision for the poor, orphaned and unemployed. They represent a loving and content family. And we need to remember, though, that although Dickens' childhood was far from happy, he was part of a close family and a tight unit to a degree. Although there were obviously issues with his relationship with his mother, which we can see within some of his other novels. So Mrs. Cratchit shows Bob loyalty and affection. As a family, despite their difficulties, they really model the ideal human condition. They're selfless, they comfort each other even when they're grieving themselves. Poverty is always present, but it does not divide the family or make them bitter. Dickens shows a clear contrast between the Cratchits and Scrooge. And the Fezziwigs, they also contrast to the Cratchits in terms of wealth, but they too open their doors to everyone at Christmas. And these families are balanced against those who choose to abandon their children in schools or workhouses, and those children who are left to roam the streets and fall into crime or die of starvation and neglect. If we look at Bob's parallel with Scrooge and the idea of power in this quotation here, Scrooge had a very small fire, but his clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal, but he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, And so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle. Here the narrator is describing the scene in Scrooge's office, where Scrooge rations the coals needed to heat the place during winter. And Scrooge relegates his clerk Bob Cratchit to a really minimal fire, expecting him to work whilst he's cold. And Bob knows that if he replenishes his fire, Scrooge will threaten to terminate his job. So even though there is sort of coal nearby, he chooses not to keep himself more warm. And he tries to keep himself as warm as he can without angering Scrooge. So despite the poor working conditions, he feels that he can't say anything about it because he needs to keep his job. Because if he loses his job, his family, won't be able to survive. So he suffers in silence for his family's sake, which shows some strength of character. But it reminds us of those two sort of principal motifs, the idea of the cold versus the warmth, and how that actually mirrors the idea of cruelty versus generosity. In this next quote, we can see how Bob represents that warmth and generosity of spirit that Dickens is suggesting Scrooge needs to become more. And he does by the end of the novella. So he stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of this season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. There's another fellow, muttered Scrooge, who overheard him. My clerk, with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam. Now, if we remember, Bedlam was the psychiatric hospital at the time, so he's trying to sort of say, how can you just be happy with 15 shillings a week when you've got a wife and a family? There's no way you will experience a Merry Christmas. That would make me go mad. But the irony there, of course, is that Scrooge only pays him 15 shillings a week, and could afford to give him more if he wanted to. He knows that the wages his clerk and his family subsist on, and he makes a joke about it, which I think actually it shows two things. It shows his complete cruelty at this stage of the novella, but it also shows that he really believes that you can only be happy with wealth. And that brings me back to the conversation between him and Fred, where he says, how can you be happy or poor enough? And he says, well, how can you not be happy or rich enough? But this richness, according to Dickens, is not about financial gain, but wealth of spirit. And there is also the fact that Bob really loves his family, but is ultimately quite powerless. And we can see this in this quotation. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side and dreaded that he might be taken from him. Here Scrooge is describing the scene within the Cratchits' house, and he sees while he's with the ghost of Christmas present. And so we get to view this scene through Scrooge's eyes, which is quite interesting, and it marks quite an important stage in Scrooge's transformation, therefore. And he has this sort of like sense of wonder at Bob's behaviour. We can see that in words like, as if he loved the child and wished. Well, of course he does. Bob obviously behaves as if he loves Tiny Tim with all of his heart and fears, because he does. And the reader reflects on the lack of parental affection, therefore, in Scrooge's childhood, and we can think about that when the ghost of Christmas past takes him to see Fan at the school. So Scrooge may be realising for the first time how much some fathers do love their children, which was something that he didn't feel himself. Tiny Tim is also, some might argue, symbolic of Jesus within the novella. And we can see that to a degree in this quotation. It says, however and wherever we part from one another, I am sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we? Or this first parting that there was amongst us. And I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it. Tiny Tim is a highly sentimentalised character, and Dickens uses him to highlight the tribulations of England's poor and also to elicit sympathy from the middle class and upper class readership, because he's completely innocent and pure. He's often compared to Jesus because he's able to rise above his own needs and suffering, and he dies in suffering so that others don't have to. He enables the characters around him to transcend spiritually. He reflects this spiritual wisdom of a much older person, probably as a result of his suffering and illness, and he embodies, therefore, probably the complete polar opposite characteristics of Scrooge, who's gained no wisdom in his long life and never thinks of others at all. He also represents the voiceless in society, the most vulnerable and the most innocent. Dickens does give him a voice, though, which is one element of the novel that I think is really compelling. And he allows, and through Tiny Tim, he's able to share that Christian wisdom during the Cratchit family Christmas dinner. God bless us, everyone, in that quotation. Dickens then emphasises this message by making these the final words of the novella, and therefore cementing his words as within as a message of hope, humanitarianism, and goodwill to all. So the last comment holds a great deal of significance in Stage 5, as Scrooge has quite literally escaped hell by going to the party, or rather by experiencing the moral conversion that compels him to look fondly on the holiday gathering. He is quite literally a saved man, and the story of his redemption ends with a note of extraordinary optimism. And the famous last words, therefore, of the novel, God bless us, everyone. And I think that this does convey perfectly the fellow feeling and good cheer to which Scrooge awakens as the story unfolds on Christmas Day. There's a second function of the Cratchits, though, and that is to highlight just general issues around the poor and be a little bit of a vehicle for Dickens's views on this. So we know that Dickens was particularly disgusted with the writings of the economist Thomas Malthus, who argued in his essays on the principle of population in 1798 that population growth would always outpace food supply, resulting in unavoidable and catastrophic poverty and starvation. His equations, although they have actually been debunked since then, they sort of postulate that population growth will occur according to a geometric sequence, while food supply will grow according to an arithmetic sequence. But essentially, in his pamphlet, The Crisis, he supported the poor laws and the workhouses, arguing that any man unable to sustain himself had no right to live. And I think that's the key part there. Much less participate in the development of society. So Dickens actually alludes to Malthus, we know, in Stave 1, when Scrooge echoes the views on overpopulation. And actually the Cratchits are Dickens' defence against this large-scale, purely economic, almost inhuman mode of thought. And this is, I suppose, to us a reminder that England's poor are all individuals, living beings with families and lives. They're not just a mathematical equation or a numerical discrepancy. This, if we think about the closing stave as well, the Cratchits also act as a plot function. So they provide an optimistic and upbeat conclusion to the story, and they show the new Ebenezer Scrooge starting off his new life with a comic display of happiness and Christmas cheer, whereas he's giddy as a schoolboy. And it also rounds out the symmetrical structure of the novella, because as Scrooge encounters in sequence the same people he treated with cruelty in Stave 1, this time the newly reborn Scrooge sheds his grumpy bar humbugs in favour of a warm holiday greeting, and he sends turkey to the Cratchits and gives Bob a raise, atoning for his previous bitterness towards his clerk in Stave 1. And he talks to the people around them and no longer sees them as sort of floating phantoms. And there's that lovely bit where the child that he talks to out of the window cannot actually understand that he wants him to do that, and he uses that phrase, Walker, like, get on with you, you're pulling my leg. Also, he forces, in Stave 1, he forced Bob to suffer in the cold, and then he apologises to the portly gentleman he meets on the street and pledges lavish contributions for his charity. And he also happily attends Fred's party, whereas before the ghost visits, he had told Fred that he would see him in hell before coming to the party. So with A Christmas Carol, I think Dickens hopes to illustrate how self-serving, insensitive people like Scrooge can be converted into charitable, caring and socially conscious members of society through the intercession of these sort of moralising or quasi-religious lessons. Warmth, generosity, and overall goodwill overcome Scrooge's bitter apathy as he encounters and learns from his memory the ability to empathise, and his fear of death. So for Scrooge, the memory serves to remind him of a time when he still felt emotionally connected to other people before he closed himself off in an austere state of alienation. And he's able to remember those who are less fortunate than himself. But actually, beyond its function as a moral parable, it does contain a political edge, which I think is most evident in Dickens' development of the bustling, struggling Cratchit family. They are compelling, even if a little one-dimensional, and they are therefore a representation of the plight of the poor in quite a successful way. And Dickens, he had every intention, I think, of tugging on your heartstrings, our heartstrings, I should say, and I think he successfully achieves that. He does paint the Cratchits as a destitute family and finds a way to express profound gratitude for its emotional riches, and that's a lesson we all could learn, I think. The fact that they are just so content and grateful for what they have. And also Scrooge's emotive connection to Tiny Tim dramatically underscores his revelatory acceptance of the Christmas ideal. Excuse me. Scrooge begins to break through his emotional barricade in Stage 3 when he starts to express pity for Tiny Tim. And the reader, when he hears this unusually uncaring miser inquire to Tiny Tim's fate, I think we begin to believe Scrooge has a chance of salvation. So we're with him as a reader. We want him to achieve that. Scrooge's path, I think, to redemption culminates with his sort of figurative adoption of Tiny Tim. He's described as acting as a second father to the little boy. And then, of course, it ends, as I will end now, at the very end of the novella, where there's only one final thing left to say, and that is, God bless us, everyone.